Welcome to ZDNET. I'm Jason Hiner, and with me today, I've got a very special guest, ZDNET's Mary Jo Foley. Mary Jo, great to be here with you.
Yeah, same Jason. Nice to see you virtually.
Virtually, exactly. We're getting used to this
We
virtual
are.
thing, just as the world's starting to go back to normal. And speaking of normal, you have been such a mainstay on ZDNet now since 2006, and have seen so much in this time. Microsoft, so much has happened in Microsoft, so much has happened in the tech industry, so much has happened in the world.
Mhm.
And so this is a transition time for you. You have some new horizons that we'll talk about, in a little bit. But we thought this was also the perfect moment for you and I to get together, have a conversation about this last 16 years
Mhm.
and everything you've seen. And so thanks for doing this. Thanks for going down memory lane with us. And it's going to be fun to really think back and put some of this in perspective.
It really is. When I was trying to think back on some of the early stories I reported when I joined ZDNet, you go through the timeline and you're like, I can't believe all this happened. Even though it was 16 years, it's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, so much, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So if we put it in perspective, but let's put it all in perspective for a second, and then
Mhm.
we'll sort of go back to the beginning and maybe follow this great timeline you have of all the things that have happened and some interesting things that sort of didn't happen that might have
Mhm.
happened and all
Yeah.
kinds of things. So, but if you think, 16 years ago, Bill Gates was still at Microsoft.
Mhm.
It was still primarily a Windows and Office company.
For sure. Yep.
Right. And this was a company that had seen what was its industry leading, world leading place start to have a little bit of shaky footing,
Mhm.
and it eventually had to transform itself. So as you think about sort of all the developments that have happened over the last 16 years, what are
Mhm.
some of the first things that come to mind for you in terms of the, really world shaking developments as
Mm.
this lens you see the world through on Microsoft?
Sure. I think the biggest thing, undisputably, is Microsoft changing, like you said, from a Windows and Office company, an on premises company, to a company where cloud right now is half of their revenue. I mean, if you had said to me 16 years ago, will Microsoft still sell on premises software and services and, make that the cornerstone of their business? I would have said yes. Even 16 years later, I would have guessed that would still be their core business. And man, did the cloud shake everything up.
Mm,
Microsoft came out with Azure way back in 2010. But was working on it for a couple of years before that. But that wasn't the only cloud thing they were doing. I mean, Ray Ozzie came over to Microsoft as a chief software architect back in 2005, and his whole idea was this company needs to be shaken up. Like they
mm,
can't keep relying on Windows and Office and on-premises software. Services are the new thing. And Ray Ozzie brought together a bunch of the people inside Windows Server and said, guys, we need to build this cloud thing. Like, look over here at Amazon, look what they've got over here, and let's try to go do that. Right.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny because it's not a name that gets talked about with Microsoft much
Yeah.
any longer. But I'm
Hmm.
glad that you brought it back to Ray Ozzie, because that was so big at the time in terms
It
of
was.
changing the
Hmm.
the thrust of Microsoft. Really, before that, Bill Gates was the sort of the mind share of Microsoft was really driven
Hmm.
by Bill Gates. And when Ray Ozzie came, it really did sort of change that vision of where the company could go and what it could do and how it could make this
Hmm.
impact on the world in a much different way than it had in the past.
Really, it's hard to understate how big a change that was. At the time, the people like me who had been covering Microsoft for years, we heard Ray Ozzie give all these talks and saw the whiteboards that he would draw at conferences, and we'd be like, what is he even talking about? Like, we couldn't get our head around it. We're
Yeah.
like, what is he saying? Like, is he saying Windows isn't going to matter? It was just like such a mind shift for us. I'm sure it was even more so for the people who worked at Microsoft. Like, here's a guy who wants to turn everything into a service and like actually be platform agnostic. Like, what are we talking about? We're the kings, we're Windows, right? And it
Yeah.
was just a 180-degree shift. And he ended up leaving in 2010, but he did a lot of things in those 5 years that he was there to kind of lay the groundwork for what Microsoft ended up doing in the next 5-10 years.
Yeah. For that reason, I'm really glad that you brought it back to Reazi, you know, and the team that worked with him to really make that change, because it ended up being so significant. So I remember, if we fast forward a little to 2014, I remember when Satya Nadella, you know, was named CEO. So we're skipping over a little bit, you know, Bill Gates. We'll get to the you know, stops and starts in a second of you know, the whole timeline. But, you know, I remember when Satya Nadella became CEO, I remember writing a column. We used to do this thing on ZDNet. We still do it, actually, called Monday Morning Opener, where we would have a column on Monday morning about this. And I remember writing a story about, like, Microsoft is going to be a cloud company now in, like, the beginning of 2014, because otherwise they wouldn't put the cloud guy in charge of the whole company. And I remember that was not really a very popular idea at the time. And certainly it's become more the point than I would have ever imagined, even I think any of us could have imagined at the time. But, you know, as Microsoft has become this cloud company, certainly Azure has become far bigger a thing than it feels like Microsoft could even have imagined. Do you think that's true, or am I overstating that?
No, I think they knew they had to start cloudifying, to use a fake term here. You know, not just the operating system, so not just Windows to Azure, but also Office, right? Like, Google was breathing down their necks at this point with, you know, we've got a cloud suite of Office software, and suddenly it was like, wait, we got to do this with Office too, right? And so I feel like a lot of the forces all were kind of converging at the same time to drive them to the cloud and all the different parts of their business. And Satya Nadella was the right guy, in hindsight, to manage that transition. I remember when he was appointed the CEO, I knew who he was just because I had covered Microsoft so long and had watched him progress, you know, through all the different parts of the company on the server side and Bing and services. But so many people are like, who is this guy, right? Like, I've never heard of this guy before. And suddenly he's the CEO of Microsoft. Like, who is he, right? So yeah, I think he was the right guy, though, in hindsight, because he understood, you know, the importance of data platform to how Microsoft was going to evolve. You know, a lot of other CEOs probably wouldn't get into the nitty gritty like that, but he understood, like, you know, why do we need databases, and why do we need to put them in the cloud? Why do we need connectors to different services from other companies? For him, this was just like, I know how this all works. And I think it was lucky that he was the guy who they brought in to kind of oversee this huge transition for the business.
Yeah, it's so true. And culturally, it seemed like such a huge change. It's such a different Microsoft, much more like purposeful, not sort of necessarily with sharp elbows out there, you know, in the market as much. Just sort of like really focused, purposeful, doing good work, not necessarily tooting their own horn all the time, and getting a lot done. That's sort of what it seems like, you know, at least from the outside. I
mean, it was fun as a reporter to cover Steve Ballmer, because he just was very bombastic, right? Like, he would say and do all kinds of, like, big, crazy stuff and just try really insane things. And you feel like Satya Nadella is much more measured and thinks things through. You know, when he first came in as a CEO, he made a big deal out of being a cultural steward. And that was a perfect time for this, because a lot of people at Microsoft right then had very low morale, and they were very like, I don't know what's going on with this company. I'm worried about my job. I'm worried about the direction of the company. And he was a very, very much like a unifying and calming influence, I feel like right away after he came in 2014, you could feel a really different morale inside the company when you'd go there or talk to people. It was very, very different.
Yeah, nice. There's lots more to cover. So those are sort of the big picture things that happened of this company that really did transform over this period of 16 years that you've been covering it for us, and you've been covering Microsoft longer than that. Maybe, Mary Jo, will you go back a little bit to some of dive in on some of the details. So when you came to ZDNet in 2006, tell us, like, I'm trying to remember, how did you end up here? Right. I remember I was talking about like Stephen Howard Serene,
right.
and, you'd talk to and that, but how did you end up on ZDNet? What were you doing before you came to ZDNet? And yeah, before taking on this beat to just cover Microsoft full time, what did it look like for you?
So right before I came to ZDNet, I was working at the old Ziff Davis. We've had so many name transitions: ZDNet, Ziff Davis,
Yes.
ZD, right? Like, I used to work a long time ago at PC Week, which then became eWeek. I worked for the original internet business at Ziff Davis, and then a lot of us who worked there ended up coming over and starting the new ZDNet that is what exists today.
Yeah.
So it was like we kind of stayed in the family, but moved around organizationally a bit. But before that, it's kind of funny. When I first started out in the tech computing business back in 1983, I'm dating myself here. Awesome. My very first time I interviewed anyone at Microsoft was in 1984. That was Bill Gates. I wrote a cover story back in 1984 when I knew absolutely nothing about Microsoft software, operating systems, none of it, right? I just went in and learned, and I was like, oh, this company's really interesting and cool. And then for a number of years, I covered Unix, ironically, because at that time, Sun Microsystems was really big, and that was a hot beat. Like if you were the Unix reporter, that was a thing, right? So,
oh yeah.
Yeah. So then at PC Week, one day their Microsoft reporter quit, and they were looking around like, who can be the Microsoft reporter? And I remember John Dodge, who was the editor, he said, Mary Jo can, because she covers Unix, and Unix is just like Windows NT. Not really, but you know what? It worked. And that's kind of how I ended up doing it full time. It just was kind of thrown into my lap, and I ended up moving to Redmond, not to Redmond, but Seattle for a while, and lived there for a number of years and really got to know the company and the people. So yeah, it's been a wild ride and a fun ride. And I feel really lucky and privileged that I got to go along and learn on the job and meet so many cool people and write so many interesting things.
Very cool. So how long has it been since you've been solely focused on Microsoft now then? Since in the 90s?
Yeah, in the 90s. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, because Windows NT, I love that. Windows NT 4.0, that was like the thing that had a really strong run for a while there.
It did. Yeah, I was like in person at the Windows 95 launch, right? Like I was there in the front row. It was like
nice.
It was. You go back and you think of all the cool things that got announced and how you get to be part of it as, on the outside as a reporter, but still you got to watch things evolve and be created. And it's been really interesting and fun to be a participant in this.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that Windows 95 launch. That was probably Microsoft's glitziest launch ever, right? And that was really before Apple did its very glitzy things. Well, maybe not completely, because there was Jobs in 84 with the first Mac, but this was their version of like that Jobs 84 keynote with the first Mac. Right. Windows 95, if I remember right, like Jay Leno was there.
He was.
And like it was massive.
There was a Ferris wheel on campus. And I mean, it's hard for people to even like kind of relate to this because nobody does launches like this anymore. But it was like a giant carnival. The weather was perfect. It was a beautiful, sunny, summer day in Seattle. And I just remember walking around going like, I feel like I'm on a TV set or something. It doesn't even feel like I'm in a tech conference, right?
And then I remember one, I want to say it was 2007. What would have been the release in 2007? Maybe Windows Vista?
Maybe Vista, yep.
Where it was like the WoW starts now. I remember that. I was like, oh, that's painful. But it was like at Nokia Theater in New York, though. It was where they had the big one there. And they had these like, they were like, there was this very glitzy thing that there was like these people, they were like window washers climbing buildings and like building a whole thing. It was so wild. They don't really do events like that for Azure announcements and launches, do they?
Not really. The funny thing about the Azure launch, though, that I still remember was the code name of Azure when it was being developed was Red Dog. And so the day they launched Azure, the team that a lot of the members of the team that built it were there on stage at a PDC, a professional developers conference. Yeah. And they were all wearing red shoes. And
interesting.
I remember I looked and I said, oh, that's like a tribute to the code name, right? That's it. Like that's a little subtle tribute here, not like a Ferris wheel and Jay Leno, but
Yeah.
like, you know, there
Yeah.
was still like a little bit of insider kind of fun there.
Nice. It's a much more subtle company now,
It
much
is.
more focused, much more
For
purposeful,
sure.
sort of more, little more substance, a little less sizzle,
Yeah.
perhaps. Yeah.
Mostly.
Very cool. So when you came on board and at ZDNet 2006, it really was only a couple years, 2008, when Jobs moved over and decided that he was leaving his day-to-day, work at Microsoft. Well, tell us about that. What was, you had already interviewed Jobs, you'd known
Once.
him from before. So tell us about that transition and what that meant, at the time.
Yeah. So, I wasn't paying a lot of close attention to Apple just because I was so consumed with Microsoft, but it was interesting to think about the parallels with Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. They were friends, right?
Yeah.
Like frenemies, kind of like competitors, but also friends. And when Gates announced he was leaving his day-to-day job in 2008, I remember thinking, I wonder how much this is going to change Microsoft, right? Is it going to really, like, how much of the company is driven by the personality at the top, the founder, basically, right? And it's been interesting to kind of unwind that and watch how much of Microsoft was Bill Gates. And now I feel like even though it's still Bill Gates' company, quote unquote, it's not really the Microsoft that he built anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, I don't know if that's true of Apple also, but I feel like at first the company is so driven by the cult of personality of the person. I mean, when I used to cover Microsoft in the old days, people at the company would try to look like Bill Gates. Like, people worked there, like they'd have their hair the same way, they wear the same kind of glasses.
Wow.
Like, it was just like a total like Bill worship kind of thing. And I was just like, wow, because at the time it was a heady time. Like,
Sure.
it was much more of a wild environment, like people sleeping under their desks and that. You hear all these stories about it, and it was all true. Like, people were really driven to build the products, and people were younger, right? So they didn't have families in a lot of cases, and so their whole life was the company. And then what's kind of cool is I feel like I got to grow up with that because I was very young when Gates was young. Like, we're not that different in age, and as things kind of evolved and I was watching Microsoft grow up, I was growing up, right? And it was like, priorities change, and things that you thought were really cool to do when you were young, not so cool to do when you're older and have family, right? So yeah, it was fun. It was a fun parallel for me.
Yeah. How about then you mentioned a little bit about the Ballmer age. Oh, actually, one thing I want to talk about before we move to Ballmer for a second was there was in this timeline you've made of kind of this period. There was something that I had forgotten about, which was the Microsoft offer to buy Yahoo in January 2008, $44 billion. That's like $44 billion acquisition that's like 2022 money, right? Whereas like most of these acquisitions before this time were like, if you bought something that was 5, 8, 10 billion, that was like a massive acquisition that everybody was like, you're crazy. You should never acquire anything that big. And this was 44 billion at the time. So take us back to that moment for a second.
This moment still gives me indigestion when I think about this moment.
Yeah.
For a couple reasons. One was I was sound asleep when this happened. I forget. I was at a conference or something, and one of my friends called me and said, "You're not going to believe this. I'm watching the news on TV right now, and Microsoft just bid $44 billion to buy Yahoo." And I'm like, "You're crazy. Come on." Like, and then I turned the TV on and I was like, "Oh, what?" And it was more shocking to me because I was in the middle of writing my one and only book. I wrote a book about Microsoft. I called Microsoft 2.0 that came out in 2008.
I read that book.
I had just finished the first pass at the whole book, and then this happened, right? And I was like, oh man, I'm gonna have to go back into this book and like update it for Microsoft buying Yahoo. Like, all the chapters are going to be different. And I also at the time thought it was a terrible idea because I'm like, why are they trying to buy Yahoo? Like, they overlap in so many areas. Like, at that time they did. There was like a lot of it wasn't like a synergistic buy. It was a total overlap kind of buy.
Sure.
And I just was stunned by the whole thing. And then it fell apart piece by piece. You know, it got scaled back and then the offer went away, but then they did a search pact that lasted a number of years and it just kept kind of getting scaled back and scaled back and scaled back. And I was like, okay, it didn't amount to anything. But at the time, I just remember thinking, this is maybe the craziest thing I've ever heard that they're going to do. Although that got topped later, much later, but
yes. Yes, we'll talk about that for sure. So, but 44 billion at the time was so unprecedented.
It
like,
was the number. That's what I thought. The number was made up. I thought my friend was like, "Did you mean like 44 million? Like you said billion? No, I said billion. Like it's billion. Like 44 billion. Just unfathomable, really."
It really is, because there are these deals getting done now, you know, or offers and that, and they're up there in that range. And I'm like, man, I remember when 1 or 2 billion was like an acquisition that all your competitors would say like, oh yeah, they overpaid and we're so glad they bought it, you know. And when we got to, you know, Microsoft and when we got to Nokia and others, I mean, those were like, those were massive deals that were, you know, just a fraction of the size of this. So it's pretty amazing.
I know,
so
it really is.
You talked a little bit about about the Ballmer transition. This will get us to Nokia too, because you know, Ballmer had this like 5 years where he ran the show. And at the time, it really felt like, in many ways, a continuation of Gates, but he did a number of things quite differently. And in retrospect, you know, it's kind of a troubled period for the company. Yeah,
it was. Yeah, it was a very troubled period. The Nokia part, this is another one of those. I really like. There were rumors swirling Microsoft was going to buy Nokia's phone business, and I'm like, why? This doesn't fit in with anything this company is doing. Except if you knew Steve Ballmer's mindset, it was, we should be in the devices business. Our main competitors like Apple and Google are in the devices business, and we should be there too. And when they bought Nokia, I just kept thinking like, so how does this fit in with the rest of the company, like software and services? And now we got phones, right? And it just was tough to kind of figure out how that was going to work, because Microsoft definitely is much more of an enterprise company than a consumer company. And yeah, there is definitely a market for enterprise and phones, but they were, under Ballmer, they were really trying to go at it like they were a consumer device company. And that under Ballmer too is when they had the whole, you know, Surface, Microsoft getting into the PC business with Surface. And so he was a firm believer that you need to be in devices and PCs and phones to really understand how to make the software and services for them. And once Nadella came in, he was like, yeah, we're not doing the phone thing. Like, no.
He shut it down pretty quickly, didn't he?
Yeah.
Ballmer also did Bing. That was a big thing for him at the time. So it was like, in retrospect, he really let his competitors define what Microsoft became. He was sort of felt like, well, Google's doing that, we should do it. Apple does devices, we should do that. And really defined Microsoft by its competitors, instead of the other way around and saying, this is what we are and where we're going to be different and what we can do better, and not sort of play catch up with these other folks. How about Bing? Bing's still out there, you know, kicking along. Somewhat surprised it still is, but it's, you know, still alive. So we can't call it a complete failure, but boy, they spent a lot of resources on it for a period there during Ballmer years, right?
Yeah, they did. In hindsight, it wasn't a bad thing to put a lot of resources in, because Bing's not just a search engine like Google. Like, it also informs a lot of what Microsoft ended up doing with services, right? Like, this is how they built a lot of data to then in later years get more into the AI space. It taught them how to be a services vendor. Like, when they launched Azure, they already had a few services like Hotmail and such, but it was part of their like training process, you know, like, how do you run a massive scale service? And then in the end, they did turn Microsoft advertising, first Bing advertising, the Microsoft advertising into a business. Like, they make multiple billions on that these days too. So, you know, it wasn't a bad idea. It helped them create new and future products like Cortana and a lot of things along that line. But, you know, they never became number one in search. They definitely are a distant number two. But I think if you ask them, was it smart that we did Bing and like that we stuck with it and waited years and years until it became profitable? I think the answer would be yes. And I would say yes too.
Wow. That's a great perspective to know. And there are a lot of things like that in business. The things that you do that help you figure out other things are often some unsung heroes.
Yeah.
No, that's good. So how about when we get to Nadella, and they in 2013 they acquired Nokia. Nadella takes over in 2014. I'll be honest. And Surface, the sort of the Surface business of them making devices were there. I figured that Nadella would maybe let it ride for a year or two and shut it down, the Surface business. I'm still kind of shocked that it's alive. And at some points they seem ready to close it, and other points they're like seem more interested in it. That's just my perspective from the outside. What do you think about that in terms of where they've come? They do have they have created some good things, and they have a whole lab of folks working on these things that are building really well-respected machines, but it's not necessarily a super profitable business or with a lot of volume. What's your thought on the whole Surface business and Microsoft being a device maker?
So when they first announced they were going to do this, they announced Surface and Windows 8 at the same time. And we all know what happened with Windows 8. Didn't end up so well. Surface, they kept at it though. And the kind of the operating premise for why they get into this business was, we don't really like what our OEMs are doing in terms of building hardware. Like, we think they could make much cooler, more interesting, more compelling devices. And so, you know what? We're going to show them how. That's what they used to always say. Like, if you say, why are you guys making your own hardware? You're competing with your OEMs. They'd say, we're doing like reference designs. We're just showing them what they could do. And then a couple years in, it was suddenly like, no, we're actually going to compete with our OEMs and we're going to try to beat them. Right. So it really changed. And, so Microsoft will point to the fact, like, they helped popularize the 2-in-1 form factor. That's true. They did. They've come up with some other ideas that haven't been as successful, like the Surface Duo, the idea that you could have a dual screen, small device. It's a phone, but also a computing device. They're sticking with that though. And supposedly there's going to be a Duo 3 maybe next year. So, they have a lot of ideas. They've worked with OEMs. I think the OEMs you talk to now are just kind of more like, well, they're there. They're not a main competitor to us. Like, if you ask an HP or a Dell or a Lenovo, they're like, they make PCs. So do we. We've got a lot more experience doing it than they have. And we see what they're trying to do and what they're trying to show us. And we feel like we know what we're doing, and we're all here together.
They're coexisting.
They're coexisting
pretty well.
Yeah. I don't think they're going to drop the Surface line though. I always have people ask me that. They're like, so do you think now that they've established this, like, they're just going to be like, okay, now they're all making great PCs, we don't need to stay in the business? I don't see that. I think they're going to stay in the business.
That's great. It's a good perspective. They seem pretty proud of it. Like, they do these interviews somewhat regularly with different outlets, like us and others, where they want to show off, like, come look at all these fabrics that we test, on the keyboards we do and all of these things. So it seems like a small boutique business that they like to have and have found sort of a safe place where they're not as big of a threat to the OEM, but they can also do some branded things that they like, and that has a certain audience that maybe is like a sort of a tier above sort of the general consumer.
Definitely. The sweet spot they're targeting is, well, they're basically going after Apple's audience, right? Like, wherever Apple is, they're trying to go after them, because they felt, and I think they would still say they feel, like there aren't enough luxury PC, high-end PC competitors to Macs, even iPads, right? So they see this as like, we're not trying to go after our OEMs making like budget PCs or PCs for schools or PCs for, everyday middle class people. It's more like, we're trying to make luxury devices, and that's where what we're targeting with things like Surface Pro and Surface Studio. So I don't know. I bought a Surface before. I have a Surface Laptop 3. I think it's a fine device, but I think the OEMs are making really great devices now. And I don't know that Microsoft needs to be there to show them, but they seem pretty adamant that they're going to stick around and stay in the market.
Yeah, it makes sense. There are some
Yeah.
really slick devices out there
There are.
now, like from HP, and a few others too, that really do have a little bit of that Apple-like
They do.
level of
Totally.
attention to detail.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Ultrabooks and Evo, the Evo platform from Intel, they're
Yeah.
really nice.
Man, for sure. So you mentioned though Windows 8. So maybe if we'll just take a quick, we can't talk about this without talking about Windows 8 for a second, because this is also maybe an extension of our conversation earlier about the Ballmer era, of them feeling a little bit of letting them define their competitors, define them a little. When the iPad came out in 2010, it really felt like Microsoft completely freaked out and felt like, oh no, what this could go and steal a bunch of our PC sales. That never really turned out to be the case. It never became much of a PC replacement. It's still ultimately trying to be a PC replacement, and it's still maybe a little, but not there. But in 2010, it seemed like it felt apocalyptic for Ballmer and for Microsoft at the time. And so we got Windows 8 of like, we're going to change our whole operating system, and we're going to make it all, even tablet friendly, but you can still run your Microsoft apps on the side.
Right.
What is that? That's how I remembered it. What's your memories of the whole Windows 8 period?
So ironically, we are exactly 10 years as of the week, next week, the week of October 26th. It'll be 10 years since Microsoft launched Windows 8 and
Windows
Surface.
8. Wow. Yeah. Man.
It was October 20, I think it was 26, 2012.
Yeah.
I remember when it came out, a lot of us didn't think they were actually going to do what they had been showing in the demos, and showing as in prototype form and showing at conferences. Cause I'm like, there's no way they're going to make Windows into a touch first operating system, right? Because they know their audience isn't looking for this, right? Like they know their audience is keyboard mouse audience, right? And then when it came out, I just remember being like, nope, they did it. Wow. One of my worst and favorite stories about Windows 8 was right after it launched, I was in a Best Buy. And Best Buy had a big setup to show off Windows 8 in the store. And all of the people working were standing around this giant screen with Windows 8. And one of them's like, do you know how to use it? No. Do you? No. Do you? No. So I said to them, I know how to use it, but I'm going to tell you, it's not easy. Like I'll show you, but it's not so easy. And I'm like, okay, this is going to be a disaster. This is Best Buy, who Microsoft usually trains and partners with, and the whole group of people on the tech floor don't know what this is or how to sell it or how to use it, and this is going to be a disaster. And in hindsight, it was.
Yeah. Users quickly figured out, I remember at the time we wrote lots of articles on how to disable that and get to the, back to your regular, desktop. And, the next version was really good. They sort of learned their lesson, and then they still have this kind of like every other version is good pattern that seems to go interestingly for them. But yeah, Windows 8, we couldn't not talk about that.
No,
for just
we had to mention it, even just in passing.
So as we sort of get to these last few years, there have been some more interesting developments of what, has happened. I think about a couple things that were pretty big, and maybe we're sort of at the lightning round, maybe.
Okay.
HoloLens. That, was one of the coolest demos I've ever seen on that. One felt like one of the big tech events of the decade for sure, when they unveiled HoloLens, and there were a lot to compete with during the last decade.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts, and what are your thoughts of sort of where it's going?
Yeah. So when they first wanted to show the press the HoloLens, they invited us to campus. We had to go into a room and we had to put all our gear, like phones, tablets, PCs, coats, pens, notebooks, into lockers. They locked them, right?
Wow.
And they're like, okay, come in. We're going to show you something that we are very proud of, and we don't want any of you to spoil it, so we can't have you have any of your devices. And they strapped the HoloLens on us and ran us through some demos. And I just walked out of there like, what the heck? Like, wow. It was super impressive when you did the demos, right? It was
Yeah.
like, this is going to revolutionize everything. But then when the actual device came out, the field of view was very much smaller and it was much more
Mm,
limited, way harder to use, expensive, heavy, all the things.
yeah.
It was incredible technology, but I kept thinking, like, how are they going to commercialize this though, right? Like, who's going to buy this and
Yeah.
why are they going to buy it? So, they've struggled with HoloLens. They came out with a second iteration of it that was somewhat better and improved the field of view. Then the word is they've canceled the next one and they're trying to figure out what they want to do, because the device evolved to be an enterprise specific device that has a lot of applications in business, but has no presence at all in the consumer market. And so I think they're trying to decide, like, is this the way we take this? Like, it becomes part of our, metaverse for industry play, or do we just get out of this and say, okay, we'll come back to the drawing board later and maybe partner with Samsung or Meta, like we saw recently,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think they're in a period of flux right now with it. They've had success with the underlying technology. They sold a whole bunch of these HoloLens based headsets to the army. It's been a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of the perception of that, but
Sure.
the technology has a lot of interesting implications, and I think they can't just say forget augmented reality and extended reality and mixed reality. They have to have something there, right? So I'm going to be curious to see what they do next. I'm not really sure what they're going to do, to be
Yeah.
honest.
They were ahead of the market, interestingly, which isn't
Yep.
normally their play, but this
Yeah.
one they were quite a bit ahead of the
They
market. So
were.
you have to give them some credit
You
for
do.
that. Now, the head of HoloLens also was sort of ignominiously dismissed too. So
He
I'm sure
was.
that's a bit of a bump in the road, but they have
Yeah.
lots of smart people. They can hire,
Mhm.
who they want to work on it. And likely the world's going to be moving in that direction. So they seem
Yeah.
to have a good head start there.
Yeah, I think, because they have a really strong background and understanding of manufacturing. I mean, they've got like the cloud for manufacturing, and they've got a lot of things going on in IoT with Azure, and also this whole industrial metaverse kind of idea. I
Yeah.
think they've got like a solid background if they want to keep going with augmented reality or mixed reality in this space. I think they just have to be more focused and not say, oh yeah, and it'll also be for consumers. Like, you got to pick your spot. Is HoloLens going to be an enterprise product, and then you have a different line for consumer/gaming? That's what I think would be the right direction, instead of trying to build something that can be something for everyone. I don't think you succeed that way, but
Yeah. All right. How about LinkedIn? 2017, Microsoft buys LinkedIn. This is another like very big deal
yeah.
that was very expensive, a little bit of a surprise. What were your thoughts on that one? How has that one gone, since then?
Yeah. So when Microsoft first said they were buying LinkedIn, I could understand why. Like, for me, that wasn't really a big mental leap like Nokia was.
Yeah.
Or later, I didn't have this in my timeline, but remember when they were rumored to buy TikTok at one point around 2020? That, like, some of these I'm just like, okay, I don't really see how this works. But LinkedIn, I did. I'm like, okay, you know what? Microsoft's doing a lot of interesting things with Dynamics and CRM and ERP, and then they've got Teams and Office. Like, I could see how this has a lot of synergies. The idea of using some of these, not just the educational resources like LinkedIn Learning, but also all the things that they're doing with like identifying people and, having kind of a social, like a social enterprise feed. I'm like, yeah, okay, this makes sense. But then what they ended up doing with LinkedIn was they decided to let LinkedIn basically run itself, right? And they kept it at arm's length. They let the CEOs stay there, and they didn't even call it a Microsoft property. Like, LinkedIn went on and like wrote their own press releases, like contacted the press independently. And I kept saying, wait, aren't you part of Microsoft? Like, you're right. And it was very interesting to see how they operated. Microsoft did that because they said, we want to make sure that the people stick around, right? And we know in the past we've done some really big acquisitions that haven't been that successful because people didn't like how we took over their business and just kind of rushed their products into our place and like mushed them together. So they tried a new strategy, and apparently it's working. I mean, people have stuck around. They're only now getting LinkedIn over to run on Azure. Like, this has
Wow.
been a
5
while,
years.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
and they haven't really integrated a lot of LinkedIn technologies and products with Microsoft products. They've done a few, like especially on the dynamic side, but they've gone very, very slow, very, very steady, and it seems to be working for them. So
yeah,
that's where
good.
we're at with that.
It's so interesting to see them evolve in their approach to LinkedIn, and LinkedIn has
Yeah.
continued to thrive. Like they have not,
Yeah.
they have not sucked the oxygen out of the room for LinkedIn,
Right.
which has been really, that's a win
Yeah.
in and of itself. Okay, how about some software acquisition? So you had them acquiring Minecraft and then Activision, Blizzard.
Yeah.
Activision Blizzard is not
We'll see.
closed, right? Okay. So talk a little bit about these. This is another sort of different direction that was pretty surprising, perhaps. But what are your thoughts there?
Yeah. So Mojang, Minecraft.
Yeah.
That one, when they first announced it, I'm like, I don't know. Like, I guess that could fit in with what they're doing with gaming. But Nadella was really smart. And he's like, there's a lot of other applications of this, especially in education, that are going to make a lot of sense for us. And that has been an incredibly, I believe, an incredibly successful acquisition for them. A lot of people were worried when Microsoft said they were going to buy Mojang, and also when they bought GitHub, that because Microsoft had a bad past about open source, right? And like all the people who are in the open source community are like, oh, it's over, forget it. Microsoft bought it. Let's get out of here. We're done, right? And they proved them wrong. Like Microsoft has become an incredibly friendly to open source company, not just words, but also gestures, deeds. A lot of people work at Microsoft contribute to open source a lot. And I think it was a necessity for them to change their mindset and way they dealt with open source. Like if they didn't, I think they would have lost a lot of their own employees who grew up using open source software and thought it was good, like the procedures, like the way that open source works. And I think it's been another really interesting transition that Nadella managed to get Microsoft from looking like we hate open source to now we're best friends with open source.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's another one of the big, tectonic moves we should talk about that we never would have anticipated in 2006. Microsoft now one of the world's large supporters of open source software. And they're making amazing apps for iPhone, iPad, Mac. They've become, again, one of Apple's actually, key development software partners, you could call it. Is that fair to say, you think?
Yeah, I do. Right when Nadella took over, I think 1 month after he took over in 2014, Microsoft announced Office for the iPad. Yeah. And you go back and you look at the coverage, and everyone's like, Nadella comes in and he just says to Microsoft, nope, we're not doing it this way anymore. We're going to go platform agnostic. That's not actually how it happened. Okay. Like Steve Ballmer actually was the one who ordered Microsoft to build Office for the iPad. But it was kind of at the end of his tenure, so he didn't get the credit for it. Nadella got the credit for it, right? And but after that point, Satya Nadella was like, we want our software and services everywhere. We don't care whose platform it is. Like we're done with the Windows as the center of the universe. We're in the software business and the services business, so we have to be everywhere. And a lot of people didn't believe them when they first started saying that. They're like, yeah, we'll see. They're going to do this for like a minute and then switch back to Windows. But they haven't.
Not been the case. Yeah. No. So true. I remember telling you one time that I had gone to Microsoft campus, I think in 2018 or 2019, and I was there for like 2 or 3 days, and I didn't hear the word Windows one time, but I heard Azure like every 30 minutes
5
at least, right? Yeah, where they were all talking about it, and that was the moment that it really hit me. Like, whoa, this is just such a different company, and it's pretty amazing to see them having gone through this transformation. It just is, and to evolve is to grow and is to be alive, right? To be static is to essentially be becoming obsolete. And so it's been pretty wild ride for 16 years, huh?
It has. I remember though in 2012, right around the time of Windows 8, I called a friend of mine at Microsoft. I said, you know what? I think I'm going to be done with this. Like, I don't think Microsoft knows what it's doing, and I think they're going to die. Like, I think I got to switch beats. Maybe I should be the Amazon reporter or the Google reporter, right? Because I think you guys aren't going to be around. And the person I said this to said, give me like 6 months and see what you think.
Wow. What year was this again?
2012.
2012. Okay.
So that was when it was like they acknowledged, okay, Windows 8, no, we're going the wrong way. And then, Nadella comes in 2014. And I'm like, yeah, the whole thing just kind of came back to life right after that.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm like, oh, lucky I didn't switch beats, but I almost jumped ship at that point.
Wow. Yeah. That's like midway through this journey.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad that you didn't. Obviously, ZDNet is really glad that you didn't. You have done such amazing work. You have been the authority on Microsoft for this period where so much has happened. And so it's been such a benefit to ZDNet for you being here and for you having all of this coverage and this sort of being this place where the people who want to know like what really happened, what's really happening, how should I think about this and what does it mean either for me personally, what does it mean for my business, to come here and they were, invariably people thought I need to go and see what Mary Jo has to say about it. So
thanks. I appreciate that.
it's been a great run. And so with that, I want to give you a chance to talk about, you are taking a little bit of a different focus going forward, starting, next month. And so want to give you a chance to talk a little bit, because I'm sure our audience is going to want to know where you're going, what you're doing.
Right. So I am going over to work at Directions on Microsoft. If you don't know who these guys are, you will, and you should. They are one of the most, I think, credible and well-versed companies that watch Microsoft. I've quoted them for years, as I've been a reporter, and I always go back to them because they specialize in enterprise software. They specialize in licensing topics also, which are always top of mind for people who I talk to. They're always like, okay, that's cool that they have this, but like, how do I license it? Like, how do I get it? Do I have to license it for everyone in my company? So they're really good at answering these kinds of questions. So my job is going to be, I'm not straying far from my old roots. My title is going to be editor-in-chief, and we are going to build out the content strategy at Directions together. Right now, a lot of their content, if not almost all of it, is behind the firewall, but they want to show people out there who they are and what they've got. So it's going to be my job to help get some of this content out in front of the firewall so people can see what kinds of things they know and hopefully bring some new insights and shed some new light on things that are happening with Microsoft starting now and going forward.
Yeah. This is awesome, Mary Jo.
Yeah,
I'm
thanks.
so excited for you. Couldn't be happier. You've been a one person sort of Microsoft team, not totally one person. You and Ed Bott have combined to drive ZDNet's coverage of Microsoft, for this past 2 decade and a half. Now I'm excited for you that, you have a whole team that, you'll be working with and with you taking on this role, they're so lucky to have you. And there's going to be so much, as we've talked about, just these things that have happened in the last few years. There's going to be so much more to cover for Microsoft. And so for you having a whole team to work with, I'm sure is going to be amazing.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I know I'm going to learn a lot from these guys. So
nice. And likewise, they're going to be, thrilled to have you there and verse them on the various ins and outs of software. I mean, the nooks and crannies of every project. I've never come to you and asked like, what about Dynamics or what about, this thing? And, you understand all of the projects, all of the, the things that maybe people have forgotten that they're working on, but no, they are still alive. Or you'll say, oh no, they've closed that down, even though it's still, you can still buy it, but it's pretty much on its last legs. All of those things, you've been such a wealth of knowledge on this. For
thanks,
so long.
Jason. Yeah. You know what? It's funny because the thing that's kept me going doing this my whole career is you never can know everything, right?
Yeah.
Microsoft is so huge and they're in so many businesses. I'm never bored, right? Like one day I might be like, I don't want to cover Windows today. Oh, well, I've got all these other products over here that I could cover, right? So it keeps things really fresh and it keeps things very challenging because they have got a hand in every pie, right?
Yes, for sure. More all the time, as we just
Yeah.
talked about, these new frontiers that they're going into. Well, Mary
Mhm.
Jo, I will continue to read and follow everything that you do. And thank you so much for all the work that you've done for us, and also for just being such a good colleague, good friend.
Oh,
And
thanks.
we wish you all the best in everything that you do.
Thanks. And I wish the same back for you guys with ZDNet. I know it's going to be successful. Keep going, Jason Hiner.
All right. Thanks, Mary Jo. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.